Welcome to this week's edition of VLGA Connect, proudly sponsored by Hunt & Hunt Lawyers. Each week, we bring to you the latest news, insights, interviews and discussions on issues of importance and interest to the local government sector, not only in Victoria, but nationally and across the globe. Our regular host, Chris Eddy, is currently on leave, so over the next month, I will attempt to fill those very big shoes. For those of you new to the program, my name is Kathryn Arndt and I'm the CEO of the VLGA. And I'm delighted to be with you today as I reflect on the origins and evolution of the VLGA Connect program, which we launched in 2020, thank you COVID, when at the time Chris and I were like deer in the headlights, discovering Zoom and the challenge of hanging green sheets behind us with just sticky tape at our disposal. The in-house joke at the VLGA Connect studio is that I usually just carry the watermelon. Perhaps we should offer a prize to any of our viewers who can pick the movie reference. And somewhere, deep in the bowels of the VLGA Connect studio, I bet there is footage to that effect. However, in all seriousness, because local government is a serious business, let me introduce today's program. In this episode, Chris sits down with Johnathan Spear, CEO of Infrastructure Victoria, to discuss the recently launched draft Victorian 30-year infrastructure strategy. Reid is also joining us to talk about the recent planning reforms. And finally, Helen Healy, the Mayor of Mildura, joins us to talk about the Nature Strip Showdown, a unique annual community competition where residents showcase their creatively maintained nature strips.
My next guest on the program is the CEO of Infrastructure Victoria, Dr. Johnathan Spear, no stranger to VLGA Connect. Johnathan, welcome back.
Great to be back with you, Chris, and to have an opportunity to speak with VLGA members about the 30-year strategy.
Yeah, good to have you here. Big piece of work. I don't know what you do with the other, 50-something weeks of the year. You obviously spent a week or two on this one, the 30-year strategy. I'm jesting, of course.
A couple of years of work that goes into this. It's what they say. It takes you longer to write a short letter than it does a long one, and
true.
to write it as short as we can, but there's a lot in it.
So, it's not the first time you've done a piece of work like this, but obviously developments over recent years, pandemics and the current economic climate would all play into your thinking as you bring out this latest draft strategy?
That's absolutely right, Chris. So this is the third time we've updated the strategy. First one was in 2016, then in 2021 was the next one. This is the 2025 version, and the world absolutely changes, and we seek to reflect that in the strategy, and also to reflect when past recommendations that we have made to the Victorian government have been implemented. And actually, it's really pleasing that we look back at 2021's recommendations in the strategy, and over 80% of the recommendations we made then have either been implemented or underway by the Victorian government. So what we kind of do is look forward then as to, well, what's next? What are the highest priorities for infrastructure investment and policies, and how has the world changed? And of course, some key things that have occurred since then. We're post-COVID, but also the energy transition and some delivery of some really big, especially transport projects in Victoria, and some changes to our land use planning approaches as well. And so there's some of the big things we're adjusting to in this strategy.
That figure surprises me, the 80%, and we'll get to what you've got in this strategy and the price tag that's on it. But I don't know whether you have an expectation of how much of what you say will get taken up by government, but 80%, is that a good result from your perspective?
Yeah, it is, and it's pretty consistent with actually 2016 strategy as well. So we every time we update the strategy, we do a pretty rigorous look back, and we publish a report that looks at the evidence around the implementation of the recommendation. Not every one of them is completely done and dusted, but we use that to get a sense of, well, what's government taking on board and has underway, because our role is to look forward as to what's next. We're really pleased with that result. We don't expect that government will always implement every one of our recommendations. One of our roles is to sort of test and challenge, some of the policies and investments that might be made. But that 80% plus result is one we're really pleased with. And it's a focus we have on making sure that the recommendations we make to the Victorian government and Parliament are practical and implementable recommendations. And we certainly brought that forward to this version of the strategy as well.
Okay, let's look at some of the specifics of this one. We'll get to some recommendations that might be of greater interest to local government in just a second. But headline here, 50 infrastructure priorities, but some are more urgent than others. Why have you given some particular precedence here?
Yeah, it's a good point, Chris. So this is a very deliberate decision we've made in this version of the strategy. This is the third time we've done it. We've learned a few things along the way about the value in having a lesser number of recommendations that are really focused on what are the very highest priority problems or opportunities that the Victorian government needs to be addressing with a starting point over the next sort of 5 years. It will set ourselves up really well for the next 30. And that's why we've got 43 recommendations to the Victorian government that we think need to be gotten on with over the next 5 years, and then 7 future options. So those are projects or reforms that we think the government needs to have on its radar and continue to do planning for. But the next 5 years is not necessarily the time to commence those. Sometimes because they are very large and expensive projects, and we've identified other projects that we think are a higher priority to get on with, or others, for example, residential stamp duty reform, that we think has a lot of merit, but it's going to take a while for everybody to get comfortable with the idea of doing it and to come up with a model that the Victorian government can be assured works from a practical and equity and a financial way as well.
Which of the recommendations do you think will particularly resonate with local government?
Well, there's a few, Chris, and while the strategy's recommendations are directed to the Victorian government and the Victorian Parliament, of course, many of the states' investments and policies interact very closely with local government. So I'll give you a few examples. We're making recommendations about facilitating markets and investment in kindergarten infrastructure, and in particular, the state being very clear about where it's going to invest in kindergartens, in particular to make sure there aren't gaps or deserts of childcare and kindergartens, and in doing so, being then clear for local governments and not-for-profit and private providers about where they can go. Another example is building libraries and aquatic centres in Melbourne's growing communities. We've released research that sort of identifies the gaps, particularly in Melbourne's outer growth areas, and we're calling for the Victorian government to co-invest with local and the Commonwealth governments to meet those gaps.
And of course, you've been saying that for some time, even before I think this latest strategy came out.
We have, yeah. It's one where it's been brought through since the 2021 strategy. We said very similar things in 2021. And consider that still remains a priority. And that's, I think, a good example of where some recommendations are updated, some are new in this version of strategy, some are really pretty similar, and that one is pretty similar because we do think it remains a priority that needs to continue to be worked on. We've got a fair bit to say about housing, the opportunities to continue to rezone areas for housing where there's good transport and other infrastructure in those locations, to make better use of that and to open up more housing choice. Of course, we've had a lot to say about that in recent years. One of the other things that your viewers and listeners of the podcast might have noticed when we released this strategy a few weeks ago was a call for speeds in local neighbourhood streets to be reduced from 50 to 30 kilometres an hour, particularly in areas where children are often present or playing or travelling. And that, of course, very much interacts with local governments and local streets. And we recommended that partly for a road safety reason, because very strong evidence that result in many people, particularly children, and also elderly people as well, who are more likely to be subject to road trauma. It will mean a much more safe environments for them, but also much more active travel and confidence for kids to walk and cycle to school and kindergarten, for example. Now, we're very clear that there's a role for the state in changing its standard policies to really unlock that opportunity for local governments and local communities to have safer speed limits in local areas. But of course, that's going to involve collaboration and co-investment as well between levels of government.
Just a quick side question on those issues that are obviously going to cut across local governments. What sort of input have councils had into the development of this strategy?
Yeah, quite a lot, actually. So we've been talking about the individual councils and as well as the MAV while we've been doing this. But one of the important things that, of course, that I should really underline at this stage, Chris, is what we released is a draft of the strategy.
Yeah.
We released it a couple of weeks ago. It is a draft that's open for consultation for a couple of months until the 28th of April. And those of you who've worked with Infrastructure Victoria before, I would hope know that we're open for genuine consultation. We really want to hear from people about what they think about the strategy, both things they support, nuance of change to the draft recommendations or evidence they think we should be taking into account. But if there's something we've missed or if they just think we're flat out wrong, we're really happy to hear it. And so I would encourage local communities and local governments to have their say to us, and they can do that by going to either the Engage Victoria website or the Infrastructure Victoria website, and you'll find links and ways to let us know what you think.
Johnathan, there's so much to unpack here that I'd like to talk to you about, and we probably don't have time for all of it, but it also occurs to me as you're talking about those outer growth area issues and childcare deserts, a lot of these issues are particularly acute in regional and rural areas as well. Right. How have you divided, I guess, the attention through your draft strategy on those different cohorts, if you like, around the state?
Yeah, so we're very clear that this is a statewide strategy. And actually, one of the reasons we've got a lesser number of recommendations than some previous strategies, where sometimes we might have had double the number of recommendations, is we've looked at what are issues that really cut across the state with practical things that can be done. And in many instances, certainly sometimes we've made recommendations that are specific to Melbourne or Geelong and Ballarat and Bendigo, for example. But when we look at things like better bus services and coach services, we're looking at that across the state and connecting up regional Victorians so that they can both have better transport access within their cities, but also between them. We've looked at kindergartens, schools, TAFE accessibility, which is also a real concern in regional Victoria, and we've had a pretty clear focus on some of the health infrastructure upgrades that are required, some of which is physical changes, and to some of the areas of the health system that gets less attention sometimes, like community health centres or Aboriginal community health organisations who need upgrading of their infrastructure. But it's also things like digital health and continuing to roll that out, because we know that regional Victorians can be big beneficiaries of that.
Okay, you mentioned the word digital. You talk here too about potential savings through digital technologies. What sort of a timeline do you think we would see something significant out of that through your draft strategy?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Chris. We did a bit of work that we released last year. If anyone would like to sort of go deeper on this, you can find it on our website. Because we were interested in not waiting for some future promised digital technology to come and save us, but rather what is the proven digital technologies that already exist, that are already being deployed, either at a small scale in Victoria or in other places around Australia, which will really improve the productivity of our infrastructure. So the productivity of either how we plan it or build it or operate it. So actually, our view is these are things that the wait time doesn't need to be long, and that is digital technology that we think can be deployed within the next 5 years to get big savings. And what I mean by that is it's things like building information management systems, which we know when you use that for design and throughout the delivery of things like schools and hospitals and kinders, roads, or social housing programs, we can make really big cost savings in delivering them. Or some of the digital technology to better manage our roads. We've already got it being used in the southeast of Melbourne and on some of our freeways. But if we roll that out across the whole of both Melbourne metropolitan area, but also our regional cities that are starting to experience more congestion, we know we can squeeze more out of those roads, have lower congestion with digital technology, which comes at a fraction of the cost of building lanes on arterial roads and freeways.
Yeah. Are we talking artificial intelligence here, or is that another category again?
Some of it is artificial intelligence, but it's not just artificial intelligence. A lot of people these days, I've observed, conflate artificial intelligence with digital technologies. They're part of digital technologies, but some of these things like the road management systems or building information modelling have been around for a long time. We just need to get systematic about rolling them out and using them more broadly. And then actually, there are new AI-enabled versions of this that do really help with the deployment of them. But what we've got to do is start piloting and deploying more of these. And importantly, just because the technology works doesn't mean that we've all got our heads around the opportunity how to use it. And so the elements about how we get more comfortable with using this technology and start training our people and our industry partners to use it more too, because there are hundreds of millions of dollars of savings at stake if we can deploy some of these digital technologies across our big networks of water and roads, but also in some of our big building programs, things like schools and kinders and social housing.
I guess that goes hand in hand in a way with another recommendation you make about making better use of existing assets, $400 billion worth. Big role for councils in that as well. I get that, the state obviously has a huge part of that too. Can you just expand a little bit on what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's that really big portfolio of assets, at least $400 billion worth of assets with the state government owns. And of course, there's on top of that, there's what local government has as well. The thing we've observed from research, and we're going to publish a bit more on this in coming months to give a bit more background, is that the maturity of our asset management systems is not always as high as it could be for us to make the best use out of that $400 billion worth of assets. And by maturity, I mean the level of understanding we have about where our assets are, what condition they're in currently, when they need to be maintained, and what the best, most cost-effective time it is to do maintenance, or when it is just best to retire them and build anew. And some of this is about the availability of the data. Some of it's about the asset management technology and digital systems that we have. Some of it's about the amount that we invest in the people to actually understand those systems. Because if we can do that, we'll have a better sense of how we can best use the very significant legacy of infrastructure we already have and maintain it better, because that is an imperative to ensure both that we're getting best value for money for the infrastructure we've got, but also that when we are spending our maintenance dollars, that we're spending it, in a really wise and targeted way.
All right. As I say, so much we could talk about. We don't want to repeat the whole strategy here, but the price tag here jumps out, $55 billion. I know that's over 30 years, but how do you respond to those people who say that that's just an unrealistic number in this current economic climate?
Well, it's not the case at all. So let's dive into the numbers a bit, Chris. We've estimated both the capital and also some of the operating costs of the recommendations we made. It's actually probably more like sort of between 60 and $70 billion initially. And what we've done is had a look at, well, if you being a Victorian government, get some contributions from the Commonwealth government, if you make smart use of the government-owned land that you've got, which is a big cost component for some infrastructure, and if you have contributions by some private and not-for-profit players in delivering, and in some cases local government, then the total cost of delivering the recommendations is about $55 billion. Actually, probably that number's over the sort of next 10 to 15 years. And so $5 billion a year in delivering the infrastructure that Victoria needs is but a small proportion of what we've been spending in Victoria over recent years. It's been more like $20 billion in recent years. Now, the government in its budget papers last year indicated its intention to lower that capital cost of infrastructure investment down into the teens. So we think that about $5 billion is absolutely affordable. Of course, everyone's focusing now on the ability to pay for all of the government services that we have. What our costings show is not just what the highest priority for that spend is, but also in some cases, how to spend money smarter that we're probably going to have to spend anyway. And a good example of that is our recommendations about school investment in schools and in kindergartens, where actually, given our growing population and the need, we probably are going to have to build more schools and more kindergartens, especially in the growth areas of our cities. What our recommendations do is show how we can deliver those needs to the community in a more affordable way.
So, Johnathan, and that context is really, really important to get beyond just the headline numbers, isn't it?
Yeah.
The engagement process here, I think you say you've touched 18,500 Victorians thus far. One would assume many more through the current engagement process. What does the engagement process from here on look like?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, we are open for consultation for a couple of months. We started earlier this month in March, and it closes on the 28th of April. And we've been having a whole lot of different sessions with both. We've had run webinars to explain the strategy and also some consultation sessions. And really the best way for anybody to have their say is to get onto the Engage Victoria website, or you can go to the Infrastructure Victoria website and navigate your way through, because there you'll find the strategy laid out for you, and you can dive into and better understand all of the recommendations we've made and have your say on any ones that you want. And there's some pretty easy kind of templates and ways in which you can have your say. The process after that, Chris, is we will take all of that great feedback and use that to formulate a final version of the strategy, which will get tabled in the Victorian Parliament later this year. That'll be around a year ahead of the next election. And we know that all parties of the Parliament use the 30-year strategy and the other work that Infrastructure Victoria does. So this is a really great opportunity for everybody to make their contribution towards independent, evidence-based advice that has taken into account the views of many thousands of Victorians. And we want that to include local government as well. The Victorian government will then be required to respond to Infrastructure Victoria's recommendations, and they'll put out their own sort of plan about what they're going to do in terms of infrastructure investment beyond that, which we then monitor and report on how things are going. And then in a few years' time, we'll update the strategy again in between 3 and 5 years because the world changes.
And of course, with fixed 4-year state government terms, you're always going to be running just ahead of those election cycles, which obviously is good planning on your part. But is it also serendipitous that this draft strategy has come out just before we have a federal election? Do the feds take notice of this too?
Well, it is, Chris. If I got if I was running a sort of bookie regime on bets about when there's going to be a federal election, then I probably wouldn't be doing my job properly. I need to focus on what IV needs to do. So it is serendipitous.
Yeah.
Our focus is certainly on giving the Victorian government, current and future Victorian governments, and all members of the Victorian Parliament, good, independent, evidence-based long-term advice. Having said that, we know that our colleagues at Infrastructure Australia and other federal politicians do take into account Infrastructure Victoria's work in giving their advice around federal government infrastructure investment. And what we would hope is that many of the projects and reforms that we've identified in this strategy are projects and reforms that the Commonwealth could also help to progress, including through its own infrastructure investment.
Makes sense, doesn't it? Given Melbourne's going to be, if not already, the largest city in the country. Great work, Johnathan. Thank you for outlining that for us. 28th of April is when the engagement closes for this time around with the draft strategy. Really appreciate your time to talk us through it today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Chris.
There's been a lot of announcements recently. There was one week where I think every day there was an announcement about planning and housing targets and lots of changes planned for Victoria. We thought it was time to unpack some of that and find out what it means for the sector, and who best to help us with that than our resident planning expert, Julie Reid, who's here. Hi, Julie. Great to see you.
Hi, Chris. Great to be back, and fantastic to be focusing on this really important issue today.
Well, it's pretty big stuff, isn't it? So just give us a bit of a summary of what's happened just in recent weeks.
Yeah, well, it actually happened all at the end of February. The Minister, Sonia Kilkenny, and the Premier, Jacinta Allen, announced these major planning reforms. And that was really in response to the Victorian government's goal of building 2.24 million new homes by 2051. And that's to relieve what they believe is a housing crisis. So we know that there's lots of issues in housing, and this is their response to that housing crisis. So there are three key things in those changes, Chris. First of all, these deemed to comply change to the Res Code standards, and I'm going to talk you through those just a little bit in terms of what they mean. But most importantly in that is exemptions from third-party rights, and trying to expedite those permit assessments and approvals for greater certainty for community developers, homeowners. So a lot of fast tracking potentially without third-party rights in this process. So we're going to unpack and talk about that. And also allegedly trying to make the processing simpler for planners. So anyway, the proof will be in the time and over time as to whether that works or not. So the other thing is the new tranche of activity centres that's been released, and the plan for Victoria, which we'll talk about as well. So they're the three key things really that I'll cover off today with you, Chris.
So let's look at the Res Code stuff. Where does the townhouse stuff come in? Is that in Res Code?
Yeah, it's the Res Code overhaul, they're calling it. And this is in these deemed to comply standards that I mentioned. So there are three levels, I suppose, or three areas in which they're focusing: in detached homes, in townhouse and low-rise development, and in four-storey apartments. So there's going to be different codes for those three areas. Now, what does this deemed to comply standards mean, Chris? It's probably on your lips about what that actually means. Well, what will happen is developments must meet all of those objectives within each of the groups, okay? So those objectives and those standards will be set for detached homes, for townhouses, for four-storey apartment blocks. And if you meet those objectives and you meet those standards, then council can't consider anything else in relation to the development. The development then needs to be approved because it's met all of the standards. So it's deemed to have complied with the requirements, okay? So in that case where it's deemed to have complied with the standards, there are no third-party notices or appeal rights. So the community will not have a say in those developments that they currently have a say in. Okay, so this is taking away the power from local communities in being able to appeal the decision to VCAT. There will no longer be that case. So that will be a fast tracking of those developments that sit under each of those codes.
Do we have a sense of how many applications would be impacted by this? And I'm just thinking about the VCAT backlog, how much shorter that would be as a result.
Well, I think they've brought this in because of the fact that they know that there is a significant backlog at VCAT at the moment. They want to reduce that. Look, I think there's a substantial amount of applications that sit within those three categories, particularly across Metro Melbourne. There is a lot of, a majority of the townhouse type developments, dual occupancies, small residential developments like that. There's a substantial amount of those, particularly in the suburbs. So if they comply with those requirements, then that's going to fast track them, and there's going to be no say by the community. 4-story apartments, probably, that the code is around 2 or more dwellings. Okay, and residential buildings up to 4 stories. That's a significant amount of development that's happening across Metro Melbourne at the moment. Okay, so I think that there's going to be a substantial amount of houses in apartment form and unit form and single dwellings that are going to be exempt and are going to from third-party rights. And so I think there's going to be a lot that are going to sit within those.
What about this notion that it will make it easier for planning officers? So there'll be less for them to do. Is that right?
Yeah, it's almost like a tick the box exercise. They're going to go through and say, okay, does it comply with this? Does it comply with that? And for example, when you look at, say, the townhouse, this is for dual occupancies in townhouses and apartment buildings up to 3 stories, for example. Things that that they've got in there are things like front setbacks, for example. So the setbacks now have been reduced from 9 metres to 6 metres. So if it complies with that 6 metre setback, tick the box, it complies, they meet that requirement. Site coverage, for example, they've altered the site coverage. So you can actually now, with these developments, you're going to be able to increase the amount of the site that you use for the footprint of the buildings. Okay, so depending on which zone you're in. So again, you just need to check the site coverage, make sure that it's within those requirements, and if it complies, then that's it, deemed to comply. So they're the types of things that will be assessed. It'll be a simpler, I think, assessment by the planners.
Sounds practical, sounds logical. Is it though?
I think it's. Look, I think it is probably practical and logical, okay? However, what I fundamentally have an issue about is the exclusion of the community in having a say in these developments that are impacting on their doorstep. Now, this is where the councils are going to have lots of issues, because there's going to be complaints that are going to be coming forward by the community, not understanding why they no longer have a say in any of this kind of development that's happening next door, because they've enjoyed those rights for so long.
Yes.
And so this is the big shift. And so I think there's going to be a lot of time taken by councils managing those complaints that are going to come through from members of the community being very upset about the new development that's happening next door. I can understand why the government are doing it to try and fast track the process. I can understand that there are communities that have been really difficult in and purposefully holding up development. But I think that there's a lot of permits that have been issued by the councils in a reasonable amount of time as well. So I don't believe that it's all the council's fault in relation to these hold-ups.
Can we quickly look at activity centres? This is where the housing target numbers have changed, haven't they?
Yeah, that's right. So, well, in terms of the housing target numbers, I'll come to Plan Victoria, which talks about that as well. But the activity centres, look, they've announced the next tranche of those. So these include 5 that will be at train and tram zone activity centres, so Caulfield, Springvale, Noble Park, Yarraman and Dandenong stations. Not surprised that they've been included. 3 that are centred around busy tram lines, High Street, Thornbury, St George's Road, Thornbury, Kew Junction. Again, not surprising. And then they've identified these other activity centres around the different train lines, Frankston, Sandringham, Alamein, Glen Waverley, Upfield and Hurstbridge lines. So again, not surprising to see some of those activity centres being identified in that. Now, what they're doing is they're introducing these new, I suppose, a new built form sort of overlay, a new zone called the Housing Choices and Transport Zone, which will apply to those walkable catchments of each activity centre. Now, there's going to be an expectation that they're going to take some heavy lifting in terms of density of housing in those areas. That's not an uncommon practice. That has been what we've been trying to achieve for a long time anyway. And, you know, they're hoping that they can enable people that live in those areas to have access to jobs and services, and also to consider the environmental impact of the continued sprawl across Melbourne. So I'm not too sure about the stats in relation to what they're expecting in terms of extra housing in those areas, but that will become clearer as time goes on.
As a non-planning person, the thing that sort of jumped out at me was this sort of tiered approach to stories from out from the train stations and beyond. That's something that's changed, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And there's always been, I suppose, a desire for there to be higher density, higher heights around train stations, and for that to taper off as you get into the suburban areas, for example. So so
much better word, taper.
That is exactly what they're trying to achieve, which is good planning practice, really. I mean, that's what we've been trying to do for many years. But anyway.
And Plan for Victoria, we've been waiting on this for a while. It's superseding the previous one. All of this is obviously encompassed in some way in this document, isn't it?
Yeah, so the launch for Plan for Victoria was interesting, actually, because they launched it in Ballarat on the 28th of February, which followed months of community and industry group consultation on the draft plan. So, and as you said, it actually replaces the Plan Melbourne framework that we've had for some time. So this is a 30-year plan, and it actually has 5 key pillars that is released in it. Housing for all Victorians. This is where the targets come in. Accessible jobs and services, great places, sustainable environments. And what is interesting that's coming through this one, which I'm not surprised about, is this whole focus on self-determination and caring for country, okay? Right. Which is really trying to talk about and commit to First Nations people and treaty, etc. So I've not seen that before in government documents, so that's interesting. So, you know, they've in Plan for Victoria, they're talking about the implementation of the housing targets. They're talking about streamlining planning in activity centres, more social and affordable homes, better quality homes and apartments, introducing minimum open space and tree canopies. But they're also talking about carefully managing outward sprawl of regional cities, which hasn't really been addressed before in a major way, but they're talking about that now. They're realising that cities and towns are sprawling and they want to try to contain that. And they also mention in this about the infrastructure developer contributions. So this is where it will lead to some change in the developer contributions practices. The other interesting action that's out of it as well, Chris, that I honed in on for councils in particular is better communicate and manage flood, bushfire and climate hazard risks. So I think that now in the Local Government Act, with the focus on mitigation of climate change, this nicely dovetails into the thoughts and ideas of how we're going to better, you know, manage all of these challenges that the councils are facing on a monthly basis, just about, you know.
So on a seismic scale, lots of detail there, lots of change. I'm sure people have been reading that really closely. How big a shift is this in the planning regime in Victoria?
Oh, I think the housing targets is the big shift, okay?
Mm.
Because the government is now saying, deliver on this. These are your housing targets. If you don't, we're going to step in and we're going to do it for you, okay? And this has come with quite a bit of criticism, obviously.
Yeah.
So there's a heavy-handed approach that hasn't been there before around the targets. The other stuff is probably tweaking, you know, where the policy has been before. The other thing that will be probably big change will be the developer contributions, where there will be, you know, a new mechanism for that. And I think that will be welcomed overall, hopefully will be welcomed by all sectors. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out. So they're probably the two, that plus the self-determination, caring for country, and mentioning the path to treaty are probably the three things that I notice that are really different. So
Julie, terrific to have you unpack all that for us. There's a lot to get your head around there. I imagine planning officers around the state are still trying to get across the detail. Big changes, it seems, and we wish everyone the best with trying to understand what it means for their individual communities.
Yeah, it is going to be a bit of a tough ride, and communicating some of that to the communities. There are already councils that are putting messages out there on their websites. Boroondara have put out a message recently. They're not particularly happy with the outcomes. They have said that they're going to have a major impact on the neighbourhoods within Boroondara. There are also concerns about the reforms being progressed without proper analysis of long-term implications, and they wanting to make sure that you know, there's key sort of common ground between key stakeholders around all this, but also they're worried about the provision of open space, schools, health services, drainage, sewage systems, all of this infrastructure question. And it's interesting, at the same time, we've had the delivery of the infrastructure strategy, which is quite timely, but councils are raising concerns about what is this going to mean for infrastructure, particularly in those, not only in the new areas, but also in those infill areas. And the same sorts of issues have been raised by Bayside Council, but Bayside have said, obviously, you know, they need to consider how this will impact on not only preserving neighbourhood character, but also about accommodating housing growth and the heritage protection of their communities as well. So whilst, you know, there's been a bit of criticism around that, and I think that they've come out quite clearly and said, you know, we don't need a strong arm approach by the government. We want to work with the government to achieve this, but we don't need this strong arm response to say, you know, we're going to pull your powers away from you if you don't deliver on this. So that part of it has not gone down very well with some of the councils, which is understandable.
And no doubt there'll be some more reaction as they have time to consider the implications. Julie, that's been terrific. Thank you so much for summarising all of that for us here today, and all the best to you with as you work with councils on these planning and other issues in the months ahead.
Thank you, Chris. Great to be on VLGA Connect today, and we'll see you really soon.
That's Julie Reid joining us today. Lots of change in the planning space, and good to have someone who can unpack that for us here on the program. Helen Healy is the Mayor of Mildura, 4 months into the term as we speak. But if my math is right, a 2.5-term councillor came in on a countback back in 2019. Helen, welcome to VLGA Connect.
Thank you very much, Chris.
That must have been an interesting experience coming in on a countback. You had a councillor that got elected to state parliament, but you've been elected in your own right 2 times since, which is a tick of approval.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing coming in on a countback or coming in mid-term, because then you realise how hefty the inductions are, because you really don't get the kind of induction other councillors get. And it's like, that's what I've been trying to figure out all that time. But no, it was great. So in fact, I've worked with 3 different sets of councillor groups, and I love it, and I'm really thrilled to be mayor.
Fantastic. Well, there's 2 very exciting things that I wanted to talk to you about on the program today. The first thing that caught my eye was your Nature Strip Showdown, which I think is in its 2nd year. Tell me how that came about. Where did the idea come from?
fun, isn't it? And I'm glad it caught your eye. You're not the only one.
Yeah.
So we started early in my last term. We were very interested in civic pride and in developing civic pride amongst our community members and our retailers, business people. And a lot of it was based on beautification. We did a lot of tree planting, and obviously through the cooler programs, etc. But also it morphed into looking at littering issues and elevating that sense of we love where we live. And we want other people to recognise that we love where we live by how it looks when people come into our community. So the Nature Strip program was one of a number of projects. And it was, as you know, the relationship between the resident and the council and the Nature Strip is kind of a partnership. It's a collaboration. And some nature strips people put a hell of a lot of effort into, and others it's just something that's there, that's a responsibility they don't take much notice of. And you know, we all fall somewhere in between the extremes of those who spend a lot of time and those who spend very little time. And so we wanted to recognise the people who put a lot of effort into their nature strips. And it might just be, you know, a spectacular lawn, which there's less and less of these days for obvious reasons. We live in a pretty dry part of the state.
Yeah.
But there are people who do extraordinary things with plantings, particularly in the natives area. And you know, there's a few veggie gardens, not many up this way, but we just wanted to recognise those people. So we have 3 categories: best grassed, best landscaped, and best makeover in a new subdivision. So obviously we have quite a lot of building going on here and lots of new areas opening up. So how do people approach having a brand new nature strip, and what are they doing with it?
So you talk about that relationship, council, resident, nature strip. It can be problematic in some areas, and some councils take a fairly officious approach to it, from, you know, citing OHS, etc. Sounds like Mildura's got a pretty relaxed approach to this issue, and you recognise the effort that people put in.
But we also, you know, it's a stick and carrot situation, as in all these things. We had a lot of people parking on their nature strip or parking across the footpaths in their driveways. So we had a program to say, you know, the nature strips are our interface between the resident and the community. So let's not park on our nature strip. And a little bit of enforcement in the beginning, but that's gone really well. We're more, for instance, one of the programs we're looking at the moment is to give our contracted waste removal agency a set of really nice postcards. And so when they see a nature strip, they just put this postcard in the letterbox, a good nature strip. And the postcard says, hey, you're doing a great job on your nature strip. It looks really great. You know, keep it up. And so those sort of incentives to reward what people are doing. So introducing the actual showdown, it's just a way, you know, for them to get that recognition. And we give them a $500 gift voucher, those 3 categories, from our City Heart Traders area. And, you know, it just gives them bragging rights, I guess.
Yeah.
And we do this in collaboration with a really fabulous local group called Greening Mildura. And in fact, they're so fabulous that their president won Citizen of the Year this year. So they help us judge the competition at the end. And yes, so entries have just recently closed, and we're really excited about who's going to win the showdown this year.
What sort of take up have you had from first year to second year? Has the interest grown?
Yes, it has. It has. It was healthy last year, but it's certainly it's ticking along very nicely, and I'm pretty sure that we've actually got a huge increase on last time. So it's very gratifying to see that people are getting interested. And then you'd be aware that as we put more emphasis on the beautiful nature strips and the care that people are taking with their nature strips, then that might sort of branch out to the neighbours going, oh, wow, or the whole street going, oh, wow, or people just recognising as they drive by or they hear about it through our different media channels that maybe it's something they could do to improve their nature strip too.
Have you had any other councils talk to you about this, looking to do something similar?
No, but really open to suggestions, and very keen, very happy to share any learnings we've had from running this program twice now.
I think it's a great initiative. Well done on the Nature Strip Showdown. Look forward to hearing about the outcomes of this second round.
It's really good. And just one thing I wanted to add is this whole beautification civic pride program we've run. We're branching now into a PR campaign, Love Where You Live. But I was stopped at traffic lights recently on Deakin Avenue, which is our main strip, our beautiful main strip. And I saw a young fella walking along, like probably late teens, and there was a fast food box on the Nature Strip outside our library. And I almost cried because he bent down, picked it up, carried it to the nearest rubbish bins.
Oh, wow.
That was a great outcome. And I'm
Absolutely.
wonder if that's our civic pride program or just a good young fella.
What a great example. Yes. Yeah. Terrific. Well done on that. While I've got you, I know you're big on public art in Mildura. You've got a very exciting initiative about to launch, or just launched, I think, Trailer Lights it's called.
It is, and it is really exciting. It's a build it and they will come scenario. Bruce Munro is a UK public artist, installation artist, and he has built these art installation light projects all over the world, and the sums are in. People love these kind of light installations and will come to see them. I guess the most famous one he's done in Australia is Field of Lights out at Uluru. Yeah. But we are now the only place in the world that has two in close proximity. So we have one that's just opened in Mildura on an island that's 10 minutes walk from the CBD called Lock Island. And by the end of the year, we will have another one across the river in Wentworth, and it'll be quite different. It'll be people standing up on a viewing platform, looking down on this beautiful field where the lights move and change in time with a specially composed piece of music. So these two together will elevate our tourism, of course. People will need to come for 2 nights because they can only be viewed at night. The one on our island here has 12,500 beautiful firefly lights, and it has 30 fishing line sculptures that edge the edge of the Lock Island. And so it's very beautiful, very peaceful here, and it'll be a different experience out at Wentworth. But not only that, we have a long history of public art in Mildura, dating back to the 60s and 70s. In fact, we had sculpture triennials in the 60s, and the director and founder of that went on to start the Sydney Biennale. And we've had a long line of just these big public art projects across the years, Palimpsest, Sunrise 21, and the sculpture triennials. So we have beautiful sculpture all through our region, and so this adds to that. And then in a more contemporary setting, we have lots of murals throughout the city heart. We have many silos in our region of 22,500 square kilometres with art on them. So, we are really I think stepping up to become a city of public art.
Fantastic. It's not long since I've been up driving that way and saw some of the silos. They are just amazing. You just have to stop and take photos and take them in, don't you? But back to the lights, which sounds really exciting. So, and clever. So, you can go and have a look at this new installation this year and then make a plan for a return trip for the new one that's coming in Wentworth, or perhaps delay your visit and, as you say, spend more than one night in town to take them all in. How much of an uptick do you think, from an economic injection point of view, do you think these will provide for Mildura?
Well, you can imagine this has been a partnership between Wentworth Shire Council and Mildura Rural City Council, and it's been a partnership between New South Wales State and Victoria, and at a federal level. So it's a big investment for us all. So, of course, when we did our feasibility studies on this, we looked at the economic input in other areas, particularly Australia, and most particularly one in Western Australia, in Bunbury. And if we get anywhere near the statistics in the visitation area and the overnight stays, we will be very, very happy.
Well, that is exciting news indeed. Lots of great stuff happening up there in Mildura, and I really appreciate your time to tell us about it, Helen.
You're very, very welcome. I love talking to you. Thanks, Chris.
That's Councillor Helen Healy, the Mayor of Mildura Rural City Council, joining us on VLGA Connect.
And that's it for this week's VLGA Connect. I hope you have enjoyed the program. Don't forget to subscribe on your YouTube and favourite podcast player. Also, just a reminder that the VLGA is hosting its annual Councillor Conference, Fast Track, on Friday the 2nd of May. This year, the full-day program will focus on the theme Leading with Integrity and will be joined by the Local Government Minister, Nick Stakos, Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Nicholas Rees, the Victorian Ombudsman, IBAC CEO, and Australian actor and comedian Anthony Lemo from the hit series Utopia. Visit the VLGA website events page to register now. We look forward to being back next week for another episode of VLGA Connect. Have a great week and bye for now.